Hello and welcome to the PFF Fantasy Podcast. I'm your host, Nathan Jahnke. We just had 14 NFL games today, one more game than last week. It was a busy day, especially early in the day with the 10 games in the early window. I recapped all 14 games on PFF.com right now, went over all the notable things with running backs, wide receivers, tight ends, their usage, and what it means for fantasy football going forward. Lots of guys to target on the waiver wire. We'll be going over those guys on Tuesday. Some sell high guys, some buy low guys, definitely a couple interesting things, but wanted to go over a few of my favorite takeaways from today. Got two running backs, two wide receivers, and two tight ends I want to go through. So we will go ahead and start with the Cleveland Browns. The Browns last week, it seemed like Jerome Ford was the main guy in the backfield. Ford had a career high in snaps, had a career high in percentage of offensive snaps. But this game, it was not the case. This week, it was D'Onta Foreman who started the game, and Foreman getting most of the carries. It was a pretty even split between Foreman and Ford on early downs. Ford was the primary guy in third downs, but the big thing was Foreman took the goal line snaps, which is something we can probably expect going forward, considering he is one of the bigger running backs in the league. Early in the game, it was actually a three-man split. Pierre Strong Jr. getting significant playing time in the first half. First half snaps, it was Ford playing 14 snaps, Foreman playing 12, and Strong playing 9. So it was a pretty clear three-man backfield. But then Strong suffered a hamstring pretty early on in the second half. I think within the first play or two of the game. So it really was a two-man backfield for the rest of the game. So if you started Ford, probably disappointed that you started him. It's probably a backfield that I would avoid going forward. If anything, I think Foreman might be the one to have more fantasy value because I think he's the one most likely to score touchdowns going forward. But interesting situation, definitely a clear change in backfield. One more backfield that I want to cover, and that's the Dallas Cowboys. It was another backfield where the person who started last week was not the same running back who started this week. Last week, there was a two-man rotation. It was Ezekiel Elliott playing the first drive, Rico Dowdle playing the second drive, and then it went back and forth between the two throughout the rest of the game. This week, it was pretty similar, except Rico Dowdle was the one to start the game. Elliott was in second. And the other interesting wrinkle here is Deuce Vaughn also got some offensive work in this game. Typically, it was later on in drives that the drive got another first down, lasted 5-6 plays. That's when Vaughn typically got on the field, so he wasn't seeing drives to himself. He was kind of the relief guy in the middle of drives. So a little odd that you didn't see Elliott or Dowdle coming in more often when it wasn't their drive, so it could stay more of a 50-50 backfield. Now it's a clear three-man backfield. I think if you want any of them for fantasy, it's probably Dowdle. I think Dowdle has the best chance, at least of these three players, to emerge and see more playing time going forward. Just because Elliott has so many carries throughout his career, I think Dowdle's the one that has the chance to see be able to handle a larger workload. Deuce Vaughn at his size, I'm not sure how much work the Cowboys will ever give him in any single game. Dalvin Cook remains on the practice squad, has not been called up. I haven't heard any news about Cook in the past 2 weeks, so I'm not sure how he's been doing on the practice squad or if there is a chance that Cook could get more involved going forward. But I think this is a situation to watch, especially as we keep going for a couple more weeks. Maybe they end up trading for someone. Maybe someone gets cut that we don't expect. But I think this is a backfield that we will probably be, or at least I'll be talking about in the recap article more often than not. I expect this to be kind of the situation. Before I move on to wide receivers, I do have a couple questions in the chat that I want to address. Is anyone worth picking up among the Kansas City running backs? I think Carson Steele is probably the one to get out of the running backs. He mixed in on the short yardage and goal line situations. He was the only other one to take any snaps on early downs. Samaje Perine was only the third down back in this one, and then at the very end of the game took snaps in the 2-minute drill only after Isaiah Pacheco left the game. But Obviously, you wait to hear in the next day or so what the extent of the injury is before deciding who to pick up. And then Clyde Edwards-Helaire, haven't heard anything about him over the past 2 weeks since he was added to the injured list. Definitely out for 2 more weeks. I could see him also mixing in. So while I think at the moment Steely is probably my top running back option off the waiver wire, also dependent on Joe Mixon's injury, we'll see if we get any news on that. But I don't think it'll be a long-term solution. And then also a question about the Saints, or at least a comment about the Saints with Alvin Kamara. Kamara off to the best start of any running back so far this year in fantasy. So he's been doing an excellent job, which he seemed to be someone kind of on the decline over the past couple of years. But I think the change in offensive coordinator has worked wonders for this offense, has done a lot of good things for Kamara in his career. Taysom Hill, probably the guy that I was highest on heading into this season that hasn't panned out quite so far. And I think a big reason for that is because Kamara has been so efficient in the run game that they haven't needed Taysom Hill to run the ball too much. So Saints off to a great start. Really looking forward to see what they can do going forward. Next, I want to jump into 2 wide receiver situations. The first one is in Seattle, where Jackson Smith-Njigba put up the best game of his career, over 100 yards, double-digit targets, double-digit receptions. So this has been great to see. In week 1, the big thing that I was talking about with him heading into the season is how much is he going to play in 2 wide receiver sets. And the first week he did play a little over half of the snaps, but it was worth noting that Tyler Lockett was injured and not 100%. Thought he might be on a snap count, was still limited a little bit in practice this week, but we again saw Smith-Njigba play 7 of 12 snaps in 12 personnel. So I think we might be at the point where Smith-Njigba is the clear top 2 wide receiver in Seattle, with Tyler Lockett being the third, like a lot of people were speculating on throughout the offseason. But it's nice to finally see that come to fruition. Seen the last 2 weeks him play more than he was ever playing at any point last year, outside of one game where they played a lot of 11 personnel. So this has been great to see for Smith-Njigba. I think he's someone that can probably be in fantasy starting lineups in most leagues going forward. So very good to see out of him. Still worth seeing if Tyler Lockett ends up not showing up on the injury report sometime soon, and if so, if he starts seeing more playing time again. And Lockett, we saw in week 1 that he is still a talented wide receiver, but the Seahawks have 3 clear guys that can play in this offense. So I think the Seahawks offense is going to be a fun one to look at going forward. Other wide receiver situation I want to cover is the Washington Commanders. It was a different rotation than what we saw last week. We know heading into the season that things would look very different this year without Jahan Dotson, without Curtis Samuel in the offense. So Terry McLaurin, a clear outside wide receiver for them, was on the field almost every play, most targeted of the group, even though that didn't lead to as many yards or touchdown as some people would like. So I still think McLaurin can pick things up going forward, but where my interest was the rest of the wide receiver rotation. On week 1, we saw Dyami Brown and Olamide Zaccheaus rotate on the outside opposite of McLaurin, and then Luke McCaffrey taking all of the snaps basically in 11 personnel, the clear slot receiver for them. But things were a little bit different this week. This week, Noah Brown got into the rotation. Brown was with the Texans last year, had those back-to-back weeks where he had over 150 receiving yards, but was just an odd man out in the Texans' very crowded wide receiver room. So Commanders picked him up. Brown was the 5th wide receiver in this one, but the change was that Olamide Zaccheaus, who was an outside wide receiver for them in week 1, moved to being more of a slot receiver for them this week. Zaccheaus back with the Eagles last year was more in the slot. Back in the years before that with Atlanta, playing more in the slot. So Luke McCaffrey went from being the full-time slot player in 11 personnel to having to rotate a little bit more with Zaccheaus. So not the best news for McCaffrey. McCaffrey also not with the target in this game, so not great to see from him. And then Dyami Brown, instead of rotating with Zaccheaus, had to rotate a little bit with Noah Brown. So Noah Brown getting a little involved with the offense, but the big thing was his stats were better in this game than the any other wide receiver for Washington. Only targeted 3 times, but he caught those 3 passes for 56 yards, where the leading receiver for the team was Zach Ertz with 62 yards. Third leading receiver was Austin Eckler with 47 yards. McLaurin, 6 catches for 22 yards. So not the best game out of McLaurin, but the rest of the wide receivers just barely involved, a couple of targets each, a couple catches each. So I would not be at all surprised with Noah Brown, considering that he's relatively new to the team, less than 3 weeks with them so far. If Noah Brown starts gaining more and more playing time, and considering his chemistry with Jaden Daniels in this one, I wouldn't be surprised if Noah Brown can become that number 2 wide receiver for Washington this season, potentially the number 2 option in this offense overall, ahead of Zach Ertz at tight end or Eckler at running back. So Noah Brown, I'm writing my waiver article once I'm up here, and we'll have that up for Monday morning. Noah Brown will be one of the wide receivers on that list because of his production in this game and the possibility that he sees a little bit more playing time going forward. Before I move on to the one tight end situation I want to talk about, a couple other, or at least one other question in the chat I want to bring up. Is Braylon Allen worth a waiver wire grab? I think it's fine in deeper leagues to pick him up, but I think he's mostly a handcuff option at this point, even though I could very well see him getting 5 to 10 touches a game going forward, just to make sure that they're not overworking Breece Hall. Allen ended up scoring the 2 touchdowns, but I don't see him earning a lot more playing time because Breece Hall is still really good, and Hall isn't going to be losing playing time to Allen. So he's not someone that I pick up because I think he could be a starter anytime soon, but there are plenty of leagues where the top 64 running backs are all on fantasy rosters, in which case Allen should definitely be on the roster, since we saw in the preseason he was in a little bit of a rotation and a little bit of a battle for that backup spot, but it is pretty clear now that he is the number 2 guy with the Jets. So if something were to happen to Breece Hall, then Allen would probably be a clear fantasy starter. So Allen is worth adding and just leaving him on your bench in case something does happen. But if you are in need of a running back in the more immediate future, then there are probably other running backs off the waiver wire that I would look at. And then another comment, just a crazy week for injuries this week. A lot of good players getting hurt. Hopefully a lot of them aren't too bad of injuries. Justin Jefferson already sounds like he's going to be fine. I believe Amon-Ra St. Brown should be in decent shape, but we'll see there. A couple running back situations that hopefully aren't too bad. A lot of guys that I drafted on my Scott Fishbowl team, so not great to see from that perspective, but hopefully a lot of these guys are healthier than we expect because you never want to see injuries. Next, I will go to tight ends to close this out, and it is with the Bengals and Mike Gesicki. Gesicki had a huge game for the Bengals. Basically, none of the wide receivers had a lot of work, and Gesicki caught 7 of 9 targets for 91 yards. So a huge week for him in terms of receiving production, but this is not something that I would expect to be normal for him going forward. The first note with the Bengals is that Tanner Hudson was inactive for this game, showed up on the injury report midweek with a knee injury. So we already knew heading into this week that Gesicki would see a little bit more playing time. Hudson was one of the primary receiving tight ends for the Bengals last season, but we've known that Zach Taylor has consistently had this big rotation of tight ends, and that's continued so far this season. So with Hudson out, Gesicki was the clear tight end in receiving situations, but in 12 personnel, it was still Drew Sample and Eric Gall and playing almost all of the snaps. Gesicki not even seeing 50% of offensive snaps. So I think a lot of this had to do with Hudson being out. A lot of it also had to do with T. Higgins being out, so they didn't have the same depth at wide receiver that we're quite used to. And then they're playing Kansas City, where they need to pass the ball a ton. They were not able to run as much as they wanted. So I would not be at all surprised if the Bengals are playing better in the future. They don't need to have as much 11 personnel. They have more rotation in 11 personnel because even though Gesicki is the primary tight end in 11 personnel, we still see Drew Sample taking about a dozen of those snaps each week in situations where it could be a run play or a pass play, where Gesicki is more on the field when it's pretty clear that they're going to pass the ball. So I don't think Gesicki is going to keep running enough routes in order for you to want him on your fantasy team. I still think I'll catch a couple passes each game, and there'll be some games where he's not catching any passes. And there is probably going to be a game or two that's like this where he's catching a ton of passes again, but it's going to be hard to know when that's coming. There are a couple of tight ends like that this year where they're very game script dependent, and how much they're on the field will depend on how much 11 personnel the team uses. And it's an odd case for tight ends this year. I feel like when I went over the waivers and who I was going to include and not include, a lot of it had to do more so with the playing time that the tight end was going to have rather than how many receiving yards they had this week. So that's going to cover it for tight ends this week. While this was 5 of my top 10 recap, I will have the entire top 10 recap up on the site tomorrow morning. And if you don't want to wait for tomorrow morning, I do have the full recap to every game. I have at least one in-depth comment and paragraph about each teams, whether it's a running back, wide receiver, or tight end. Luckily, there were a number of things that were similar to last week, so that didn't have to be too much I had to touch on. But there was at least one interesting thing for every team, and there were a couple of teams where there were plenty of things that were interesting. And I will get to one more question before I fully sign off. Thoughts on the Bengals running backs. And Zach Moss is someone who took the clear lead in the backfield. Chase Brown, it was very similar to last season in terms of how much Chase Brown was on the field, just mixing in a little bit on early downs, but it was Zach Moss taking all the other work. Moss having a bigger role than even Joe Mixon had late last season because Zach Moss also playing on third down. So I think Zach Moss, when I have my 5 to add, 5 to drop, 5 to buy low, and 5 to sell high, I could very well be putting Moss on someone to buy low because he didn't put up quite the numbers in this game. But if the Bengals can get back to form, which they've had slow starts to every season these past couple seasons, so if they can go back to being one of the better offenses in the league, I expect much better games out of Moss going forward. So Chase Brown, I think someone that if you're in a lighter league where there's either 8 or 10 teams or you don't have that many guys that you can throw on your bench, Chase Brown is probably someone that I'm okay dropping because I don't see him having that standalone fantasy value anytime soon. And he would be the guy if Zach Moss were to get injured. But if you're in one of those lighter leagues, then there's a lot of guys that are available on the waiver wire that are clear handcuff options. So at least worth considering dropping Brown depending on what your roster needs and what the size of your league is and so on. So that covers it from a utilization perspective. But if you do want to know more about whether it's defensive players or the offensive line and how those players were used or how well anyone played, at PFF Plus, we have our premium stats where you can go see all of those level of details and also look on a week-by-week basis. A lot of times I'm just covering what's happened this past week, but if you want to go back and see what happened week 1 or as these weeks go on, see how players play over the course of several weeks and how their snaps are either improving or declining, then you can get that with our premium stats. And that's a great way to use your subscription. Plus, a number of my articles are also you also need a subscription to read those. Luckily, the recap articles are free and will stay free throughout the season. So if you just want those, you can still get those. But if you want to go a lot deeper than what I'm able to get to in the articles, then you need that PFF subscription. So that'll handle it for me tonight. I do have the recap article. Like I said, top 10 recap and waivers will go up in the morning. Rankings will be on Tuesday, as well as 5 to add, 5 to drop, 5 to buy low, 5 to sell high. Rest of season rankings on Tuesday as well. We'll have start to sit on Thursday, so that covers my written content, as well as the Monday Night Football recap and Thursday Night recap. And then in terms of podcast, I know John is also doing a similar thing to this, but on the IDP side. That'll be up tomorrow morning. John and I will also be going over the waivers Tuesday morning on the podcast. John will continue his usual IDP show, and then there will also be the Start Sit show with John and Nick on Thursday. So until you either read one of my articles again or see me again on Tuesday, peace out.